Tribute Pod production.
Feeling good? Here we go.
Open Secret.
Hello and welcome to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. I'm Kylie Pert.
And I'm Jane Van Teenan. Thanks for joining us.
Today on Open Secret, we're talking about the heart of OSINT. And no, it's not a tool, a plugin, or the latest AI prompt. It's people. And there's no one I'd rather have this conversation with than Ritu Gill. Ritu is a Canadian open source intelligence analyst and educator with nearly 2 decades of experience, including over 12 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. She likes to keep busy, including to run her own consultancy, train professionals all over North America and the world, and she just so happens to be president of the OSMOSIS Association, which is basically the unofficial clubhouse for the global OSINT community. In this episode, we explore how OSINT is built a little differently. It grew from the ground up, from volunteers and independent analysts to professionals inside government and industry. OSINT isn't about being locked behind closed doors of the 3-letter agencies. It feeds off in forums, Twitter threads, blogs, and browser tabs. It's collaborative, it's curious, and it's still evolving. In this episode, Jane and I talk to Ritu about what makes the OSINT community so special, how we build and protect trust, and what leadership looks like in a world where the line between professional and passionate is a little bit blurry. We also talk about boundaries, burnout, and building each other up in a field that can be both thrilling and heavy. This one's for the people behind the platforms, the humans who make OSINT work and quietly change the world.
All right, Kylie, I am super excited for our next guest, Ritu Gill. She is someone that I know that both you and I have been waiting to speak to on the pod for ages, and lucky for us, she said yes. Woohoo! So when I spoke to her in preparation for today's episode, I did admit to her in a moment of vulnerability that I was kind of intimidated by her and specifically her OSINT creds.
You mean you're fangirling over Ritu is what you're trying to say to the listeners?
I was. And there was also a bit of imposter syndrome too, right? But, you know, she was super gracious because she said to me in response, she's like, you know what, Jane, we've all got something to learn. And that kind of stuck with me because our conversation today is all about the power of the global OSINT community, mentorship, leadership, and I can't think of anyone better to speak on this topic. So Ritu, welcome to Open Secret. We're so delighted to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on the pod. This is really nice to be here and I'm excited to talk to both of you.
I've got a question for you because this is something that I know I sometimes hesitate on now myself. When someone asks you what you do, how do you describe it?
Yeah, I get that question once in a while myself. There's a couple of different ways you can tackle that. I think if it's someone who doesn't do this type of work and might be interested, I typically would say I use publicly available information to investigate something. And sometimes, you know, when I'm trying to explain just the basics of what open source is, it's using publicly available information to answer a question. Sometimes that doesn't always kind of answer what they're looking for. So sometimes I will bring up something like, have you seen this documentary called Don't F with Cats? Or have you seen certain documentaries that kind of bring that online sleuth part of it in there? And although I don't really identify as an online sleuth.
I like that though.
Yeah, I do like to explain that I'm like, hey, I do that, but I do it professionally. Mm-hmm. And often when I do that, they're like, oh, that's what you do. I'm like, yeah, we use it for a specific purpose, but we can utilize things like social media. And it could be a missing person. It could be something else that you're looking into, but we're trying to solve something at the end of it. And when you give people that concrete example, I think that's when they really understand. They're like, oh, that's really interesting. And they usually feel pretty inspired and they want to hear stories after that.
And so you're an OSINT practitioner and you've also recently moved into a more leadership role as well for the global OSINT community. Can you describe a little bit more about that?
I actually took on a role this year as president of OSMOSIS Association, which has been such an honor to be part of this organization. The idea with OSMOSIS Association, it is an association for OSINT professionals. We're really trying to standardize OSINT. We're trying to bring people that want to learn about OSINT and grow them and build them up and allow them to go seek out those opportunities and get a career in OSINT. Other part of that is really like the ethics part of it. That's also key when it comes to the association. We really want to push for ethics in OSINT.
And Ritu, why is that important?
There's a concept of, I would say, hashtag OSINT for good, as you have probably heard. When we talk about ethics in OSINT, it's really about showing that we can do good things and positive things in the community using publicly available information. And that's why I say we push for those ethics, because it's so important. There's a lot of harm that can be done with some of the information that's available to us, but the key here is to use it for positive purposes, and hence that hashtag OSINT for good.
While you're talking about osmosis and ethics, I noticed that it says on the Osmosis website that potential members must be of good moral character. They must sort of be vetted prior to getting membership and being part of that. Is that because a large amount of information, there's a lot of experience, knowledge, tools, techniques that have been learned through sometimes from government individuals? Or is it primarily because you're trying to ensure that the adversary doesn't get in and capitalize on what a fabulous network and community of OSINTers there is out there, and then make that cat and mouse game even harder?
I think that's a great point that you bring up. Really, what I think of that is we want people to be part of our membership that have good morals. They have those strong ethics that can help us build on that, and can be individuals that are part of our association that will also bring other people that will bring positivity to the space. I think it's really important that we bring on the right people. We have people that want to share the knowledge, but they also have boundaries and guidelines to go by.
Yeah, with great power comes great responsibility. It sort of feels like the data now that's available, particularly OSINT practitioners who are practiced in their field, is immense about an individual, and that can have some pretty huge real life consequences when used for bad. I'm kind of interested just to take you back in terms of your OSINT journey so that we can get a sense of how your career has developed over time. The question that I had in mind was, you've been in the OSINT field for a number of years now. How has your perspective on intelligence gathering evolved over time as a result of your interaction with open source intelligence?
I've worked in Intel for many, many years. I do come from lots of experience working for the government, but also creating my own consulting business. I think things have really evolved when I look back to when I started versus like where we were versus where we are now. It's kind of amazing actually to kind of go back that far and put myself back in that space, because, it's been almost 2 decades, I feel, right? It depends if I'm looking at it from the lens of the government space or the public or private sector space. But I really do think things have meshed together in ways that I didn't see earlier on in my career. So yes, I know there's individuals and organizations that work in silos at times as we talk, but I feel like there's more of an opening and there's more of an opportunity for that conversation now. Whereas earlier on, I didn't see it as much. Like it was almost like, no, we're completely two separate entities, which we are. However, I feel like there's more room for a conversation now and more opportunity.
This is public and private, you mean, Ritu?
Yeah, I feel like that's really changed, which opens up that conversation about intelligence. Again, there's so many different ways we can look at intelligence. If we're talking about intel gathering, the big difference with obviously adapting to where we are now with the technologies and all that kind of stuff too. It's nice to see it come along.
When you think about your career in open source intelligence, think back through, whether it's government or, the work that you've done in your own consulting business. Is there any case in particular that's really solidified your passion for OSINT? Like where you've seen OSINT do something fantastic?
Yeah, I can speak of that in a few different ways. So one side of it is you'll see things that we see in open sources, right? We'll see things like there's communities that do OSINT for good. And they're pursuing, say, finding missing people, assisting law enforcement with that kind of situation. There's also other organizations who are tackling like human trafficking. So those ones, like, I feel like that's huge. And it's great that we have people behind this doing these things. The other side of it is obviously when we go look at those examples, I think that's amazing. For me personally, I feel it's those hard cases where you've worked tirelessly, hours, and you're trying to connect dots or you're trying to find information. You're trying to answer that intelligence question. For me, when you get to that point where you get to answer that intelligence question, that feels good, especially when you comb through everything, and also knowing when to stop, which has often been a conversation. People say like, okay, well, when do I stop? Well, I'm like, okay, well, there's a few things you can ask yourself and you'll know when you need to, but it can be a challenge, right? So I wouldn't say there's like one particular case. I think there's many instances, and I've worked on lots of different types of projects and files, some high value ones for sure when I was, working with RCMP. That's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our federal police force in Canada. Definitely some cases that open source can open up a whole nother world to that investigation. If I think back to like when it wasn't being utilized, it kind of boggles your mind because you're like, how much information were we missing, or was someone missing at that time?
Is that the part that makes you tick, the chase of the information and the managing of the information?
I think for me, I don't just do the research. I'm building up a report. As I'm doing the research, I'm building this up. So the more I find, the more excited I am about it usually. Also, I'm more of like a tactical analyst. So again, like kind of case by case, but yeah, I do find like it's exciting when you're finding things to answer that question. And sometimes they're big things, but sometimes they're smaller little nugget, but important for sure.
So you like the tools as well, is that right?
Yeah, tools are great and they definitely have a space in OSINT. There's always the meme out there that people love collecting OSINT tools. And there's been times where I was collecting tools and like I was like running out of space. I was writing down so many different tools, but I just didn't have the time to keep up to test every single one. And you eventually learn that. But I remember having like checklists of just tools that I'm like, oh, I'm going to try this. And they have a place in OSINT. For me, it's always important to balance that between using tools, but also know the limitations and also know, can you do these things manually?
Let's turn now to the community. What it feels to me is that it's much more of a grassroots movement. And yet OSINT professionals, typically, they'll work, remotely. They're working independently. And yet they're somehow able to keep the community tightly knit and keep a sense of connection and certainly collaboration. Why is it so different in open source intelligence as compared to some of the more traditional ints?
I think it's simply because it is open source. It allows us to have those conversations and collaborate and network over these things. At the end of the day, it's about the people that really matter, that are showing up to share the information and bring what they bring to the open source space, which can be many things. There's so many different facets of OSINT.
It's all sources together.
Exactly. It really is. And people can find what their niche is. There's going to be different parts where it's like, hey, I'm really good at geolocation, let's just say. And someone else is like, well, I'm really good at report writing and analysis, which is key to OSINT. This is when, if you work in a team environment, you really can like feed off of each other and learn from each other. And I always encourage people starting in OSINT to do that, because whether you're new or you're experienced, I feel like we can learn from each other. There's always tidbits to learn from other people, regardless of their experience.
And the landscape just changes so quickly as well. To your point, when you were talking about tooling, it's just so difficult to stay on top of all of the things all of the time. And so using the power of community is key to maintaining the professional edge, I think, in OSINT.
Yeah, it really is. The community is everything. And we definitely see a lot more OSINT communities on the rise, I guess you could say. It's different spaces for different people. Sometimes there's communities based on maybe the country you're living in or the area you're associated to. There's the law enforcement community, and then there's other people that do more nonprofit type of work, but they're still doing OSINT. It's just in a different capacity. But it is nice to see the OSINT community is so large, and we have people continually wanting to be part of it.
So where does someone go if they want to be a part of the OSINT community?
I feel like there's a lot of great stuff out there. At one point, I would say, if you had asked me that a few years ago, I would have said the OSINT Curious Project. That was a lot of people that came together, and I was part of that we wanted to bring that positive space, but also bring those blog posts and video content. But we also had our ethics and the way we did it. And we're like, well, we can provide some leadership to the community. I know, we closed down that project, but there's other ways to do it. Places like OSMOSIS Association. Even when I look at OSINT Combine, definitely have to give a plug there, because when I look at the weekly, almost, I think, blog posts, that's a community right there. And also someone who's been doing it consistently. I look for people that have been doing this consistently, and those would be like the top people that I want to follow, because I feel like if they've established themselves, there are definitely people that stick out to me that I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely follow them. That includes people, but also different associations as well.
Ritu, I'm loving how positive it is about the collaboration and sharing of the community, and being online by default assists with that, no doubt, and the different mediums that can provide. Over the years, what would you say are some of the challenges, though, of having such a diverse community?
One thing that comes to my mind is, because we have so many people in different organizations and communities rising up, is we're doing OSINT from different places, different countries. So for me, the first thing I think of is, what are the privacy obligations that person has from where they are? I'm in North America. I'm in Canada. We have a lot of privacy laws in Canada versus US. They have so much public information. It's insane to see sometimes. It can be great if you're an OSINTer and you have a lot of US people. A challenge is when people are creating communities out there, they are coming from different parts of the world. The question that could be like thought-provoking would be, how do we standardize that? Have guidelines? Because someone from the other side of the world might think that, okay, well, it's ethical to do certain things because it's all open source. So they might think doxing is fine. And whereas the part of the world I come from, I'm like, no, that's not okay. You shouldn't be doing that. There's a line, but sometimes people cross that line in my eyes. We can't ignore it. All we can do is put out the information out there that people will use OSINT for good, letting people know why we don't do certain things.
So does the community self-regulate then? Because oftentimes, for a lot of the other ints, we read about oversight and ombudsmen and all the rest of it. What does it look like though for the OSINT community, and who is the arbiter of what is good and ethical?
So again, another challenge there, because at the end of the certain people in the OSINT community take that leadership role. It is kind of challenging to say, okay, well, this is what we're following, because you're going to have, again, communities kind of clashing on some of those things because we're just from different parts of the world and it might not translate the right way. Again, I think it's one of those things we're still working towards. I think it's ongoing. And I think because of the way technology is going and with AI included in this, what is this going to look like in 5 years? It's kind of insane to just think about and wrap our minds around. But myself, I'm curious because how rapidly technology and AI is growing. It's concerning, but it's also exciting because we can use AI in a lot of positive ways for our work. At the same time, we can see how it's also being used for misinformation and some of the things out there that aren't so great.
Certainly an important discourse for the OSINT community, I consider, as it moves forward. There's sub-communities together working for the greater good to do better and have better outcomes. But no doubt the devil is in the detail sometimes. So organisations like OSMOSIS or individuals like yourself, I think, are critical. One place that doesn't seem to change is the consistency in tradecraft. How do you make sure that you can assess well the credibility and reliability of the information that you're getting? You're collecting, no doubt, in very clever ways. You're getting access to all kinds of unique information. The next step, even if you're doing it quickly, is assessing the veracity of that and how usable it is and how relevant it is. What's your go-to for that?
When I think of it, you have an objective, you have a goal, you need to start out there. Having structure around your OSINT work is key, but once you gather the information and you write it all down or you make notes how you do, for me, there's also the step of like, yeah, you write everything down, you get all the information out there, but now you have to see what is relevant or most relevant to answer your question. Also, this part of it is fact checking what you've found. And you can do it, people do it in different orders. But for me, I want to be able to fact check everything that I found. What does that mean exactly? Well, is it reliable information? Have you validated it? That could mean, did you just find it in one source? Who's saying this information's true? Or can you find another source to support it? I usually want more than one source saying that this is what it is. I think that's one way to check reliability, but it's all about cross-referencing and then asking yourself as an analyst, is it relevant? Does it make sense? Does this play into what I'm investigating right now? Or is it totally like does not make any sense. Again, that's the thinking element and the human element of what we do, which is key for being an analyst. People that are starting out, there's times where you want to write like a checklist and put it next to your computer, and you can reference and say, you're working on something. Maybe it's steps that you don't want to miss. And everybody kind of will have their own workflow. But for me, I'm like asking those questions. And it could be, I've seen blog posts from OSINT people like Nico Dakins, for example, talking about asking the who, what, where, when, how. That is really key as well. Because we want to pull out the most relevant information, but we can only do that if the information is reliable in the first instance as well.
So what I'm hearing there is it doesn't really matter which way, in some ways, you're going about it, but you've got a bit of structure and you've got a bit of methodology. So you've got something at the base of your tradecraft.
The question that I guess springs to mind for me when I think about, standardizing OSINT, and as OSINT grows in prominence, you've got in the US intelligence community, for example, we're starting to hear OSINT being the into first resort and all of these fantastic things, which of course we celebrate in the community. But do you think that with this rise to prominence, that there is a risk of losing the collaborative spirit of the community?
That's a good question. Open source, I feel it is different than the other ints. I think it's going to be more sharing. The problem with oversharing, if we want to call it that, is it can be a challenge in the OSINT world because say tomorrow I find a technique or some way to find information from, say, Facebook friends. The thing is, you have people that work at these companies who are looking at us, looking at the OSINT community to identify those techniques and shut them down. It's going to get worse for us, I think, in terms of the techniques that people are posting online that get shut down so quickly. It's because if it's to do with Facebook or it's to do with Twitter or Instagram or any of these platforms, you have people out there that are literally following us that work for those companies, and they're looking to shut down techniques where there's loopholes. The thing is, a lot of OSINT people will say, well, we'll just find another way, which is often true. It's consistently been like that over the years that I've seen. A technique falls and then another one gets created.
A lot of complex challenges there, isn't there? Traditionally, governments, they do stuff because they can, and not everybody knows about it. And the general premise is that in the Western world, we're doing that for good. And now you have an OSINT community who's out there, all part of this, but it doesn't look like a traditional government structure. As we said, many governments, but it's also corporations, it's also individuals. And you know what? Tragically, for some of our listeners who are trying to learn a bit more about this, it is some bad guys. Do you see that there needs to be more structure and formal, a leadership framework? Is this even possible in an OSINT community that isn't governed by any particular government or organisation? Do you think there needs to be more formality to the community, I suppose?
If we wanted that, I don't think it's possible. I just don't see that happening. I think the way I've seen the OSINT community evolve over the last decade, I think it's something that we're not going to be able to control. We could put that out there, but I don't know if that's going to work for the open source intelligence community.
And probably damper its edge, really, in some ways.
Yeah. It might be a little bit of a buzzkill.
Yeah, exactly. And so the edge is really in what it's doing, and it's just got to keep navigating and growing and getting cleverer in its technologies, in its techniques, while still trying to hold on to having some kind of ethos behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
We've spoken quite a bit today about standards and perhaps norms of behaviour and some of the challenges with respect to setting the standard. What we haven't spoken about, though, in this sort of context is something that, Kylie and I feel pretty passionately about, and that is mental health and wellbeing of OSINT professionals. How can the OSINT community better support the mental health and wellbeing of OSINT professionals? Noting, as we've sort of said, a lot of them are working in isolation on topics. They're confronted by pretty objectionable material on the internet, sometimes not as prepared as what others in the broader national security and law enforcement space might be to confront that kind of challenging material. What sort of responsibility does the global OSINT community have to help each other out in this context?
What I see online in terms of mental health and using OSINT in investigations, or, people do OSINT for fun as well, but it can take you in some dark spaces pretty quickly. But what I do see is with the OSINT community, there's a lot of resources out there when it comes to mental health. I've worked in national security myself, and it's one of those things I've come across content that negatively impacted me. I guess that's the way to put it. But it was earlier on in my career, but lesson learned. I kind of wish some of those resources were available or I was aware of them. So for me, really the call is out to people in leadership to essentially providing their employees and staff with the resources if and when they come across that material. Because when it happens, it's just, you can't unsee something. So making sure that your staff is aware that there's help if they need to talk to somebody, and also the ways that they can minimize some of that content, because there are ways, there's tips in blog posts. I mean, things like turning off autoplay in certain platforms, because as you're scrolling, if something just plays, it could be a second long and it could be traumatizing. Like I've seen things like that. It was like 2 seconds long and I was like, okay, if I had autoplay switched off, I wouldn't have seen it. You know, that's what I mean in terms of the actual example. But I think mental health is so important when it comes to OSINT.
So kind of using the community as a resource and sharing space, but also not letting employers, that's corporations, governments, anyone who's employing OSINTers, abrogate their responsibility for those fundamental pieces.
We've been talking about how strong and supportive the OSINT community can be, even when we're working in all sorts of different places around the globe. What do you think people can gain from actually connecting in person these days, whether it's through conferences or trainings or just being in the same room with others who actually get it?
It's a place when you can get together with a group of people and you have like minds and you do the same or similar type of work. It's amazing. Like, I love to be in spaces like that. So always encourage people. I'm like, when you get to that stage and you have the ability to get out, and maybe you might need to travel a bit for some of the conferences out there, but networking is key. Meeting some of the people in that field is key. So, you know, there's a number of conferences where people can do that. So that's another pro tip I always give people.
And you're coming out to Sydney later on this year, aren't you, to one such conference, the Australian OSINT Symposium, which we're super excited about. So that'll be a great opportunity for a lot of people to meet you and for you to network too.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm super excited about being in Australia and being at the symposium. I think that's going to be excellent.
You know, I mean, I've seen you energize groups of people, Ritu, across socials, your LinkedIn profile and presence on LinkedIn, your own as well as Forensic OSINT. In your experience, what's energizing the community based on sort of what you're putting out there?
There's a lot of things that bring the community together. So I had mentioned like LinkedIn is a great space, but like, people love CTFs, right? Capture the flags, like where people, sometimes you get a prize at the end, or every kind of capture the flag is going to look a little different and what the purpose and objective is. But that's another way to bring together a community. Again, people that, especially if you're have a competitive edge and you like using open source, well, that could be a good venue for someone like that.
It's got to be the best way to learn OSINT skills, isn't it? Don't you reckon?
It is really fun. I've done them in person as well. Like online's cool, but in person is quite like you work off of everybody's energy. Like I feel like there's a little bit of a buzz going on in the room. And so it's fun when you can do that.
Ritu, if you could change one thing about how the OSINT community operates today to foster better learning and leadership, what would it be?
You know, right now, what happens is when someone says, hey, how can I learn about OSINT? There's like 50 things I can tell someone. And that's sometimes too much. I wish there was an easy button. There unfortunately is not an easy button per se, but I wish there was a kind of a smaller space to work within. I mean, there's still top 5 kind of tips I could still give somebody on how to get started or what to do, depending on what their goals are. But that's definitely like, I wish that was a little different, because I find data overload is huge. People get overwhelmed. It's too much information. And some people are just like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. And they don't, they start self-doubting and that kind of stuff. So that's not always ideal.
So what's on your top 5 list?
My top 5 list. I mean, a couple of things I would say right off the bat. We already talked about it, but people that like to do and learn, then do a CTF. There's tons of CTFs out there. To me also is, if you want to learn more OSINT, like one thing I do encourage people to do, go find information about yourself on the internet. Like, what does your footprint look like? Because some people are really unaware of what their footprint looks like. But I also tell people, like, if you have the ability to like go take courses, like analytical thinking courses, and there's, critical thinking courses, those are going to be key as well, because they will help you along in your career and in that trade craft. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I think there's so many different resources online. If somebody Googles how to get into OSINT, you'll probably come across one of my blog posts that I've written probably in the last year or two. But I'm not the only one. There's other people who have written blog posts where they'll have like top 10 tips, and you don't have to do everything, because I always tell people, again, getting overwhelmed, that's not fun. Take the top 2 things that stick out to you in that list and go start with that.
Ritu, you've shared so many tips with us today. And while I've been listening to you, I've jotted down 5 that I think I would take away and use as a starting point if I was going back to the start of my career again. And I wanted to share them with you and our audience. So in no particular order, here they are. 1, do a capture the flag. They're so much fun and great for honing those skills. 2, go to a conference or event and make a friend and start sharing ideas about OSINT. 3, find a reputable training company and sign up for some training on an area of OSINT that interests you or that you identify as a gap area. 4, read about OSINT. Read on forums, on social media, and start following OSINT practitioners writing about topics that you're keen on. And number 5, find yourself online. Really go to town and see what you can find out about yourself and the people in your life. And I'd actually like to extend this one and suggest that people also use it as an opportunity to practice writing an intelligence report about their findings, and maybe even make some recommendations about what actions to take to remove that information and clean up your own digital footprint.
Oh, those are great. Excellent. You took great notes. I love it.
You said all of that. I just wanted to capture it.
And that's one of the reasons I've written blog posts around that, because I would get so many messages about it, but I couldn't keep up with the messages, and I want to, and I try my best to respond to people as much as I can. I just want to be that space in the OSINT community where people can reach out. And, there's many times I reach out to people and I'm like, hey, like how, what kind of work is someone up to? Or, it kind of depends on, but I find like LinkedIn is a really good space right now for that. So it's kind of nice to see.
I think you really make OSINT approachable and accessible for a lot of people.
I appreciate that. No, that's always great to hear. And I always want to know how I can do better as well. And, I'm always thinking about other ways to contribute to the OSINT community. Sometimes I'll be, wake up in the morning and drink some coffee, and some ideas start rolling in, and I'm like, okay, quickly writing them down so I don't forget later. But that's kind of always been the goal, just to continue bring that positive space to OSINT, to the OSINT community.
Ritu, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been so wonderful to chat with you.
Thank you. I loved meeting you. I wish you every success in everything that you're doing.
Thank you both so much. This has been honestly awesome, and it's a pleasure speaking to both of you today.
You've been listening to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. Open Secret was created by Kylie Pert, Amanda Shane, and Jane Van Tienen. A podcast by OSINT Combine. Make sure to visit our website, osintcombine.com, for information on how OSINT Combine can help you find, analyse, and act using open source information. Open Secret is recorded on the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. OSINT Combine acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the land where we work, live, and learn.
A Tribute Pod production.